"You are a disgrace. Don't bother coming home." Those words sliced through the sterile hospital corridor, sharper than any scalpel could. My father's voice, once a beacon of encouragement during childhood science fairs and piano recitals, now fell like a death sentence. 5 years of silence followed. 5 years where my name, Charlotte Bennett, was scrubbed from family stories, like an unwanted stain on an otherwise pristine Bennett legacy. No birthday calls, no holiday invitations, not even a mention in casual conversations. It was as if I had died the day I walked away from the family's path, the sacred calling of medicine. But in the shadow of their rejection, something extraordinary bloomed. Not in the operating rooms my father adored, but in courtrooms where my words carried the weight of law, where my mind, sharp, unyielding, became my scalpel. Each ruling, each precedent, carved my own name into a new kind of legacy, a legacy built not on their expectations but on my choices. Then one day, without warning, a thick cream envelope landed on my desk. It bore the Bennett family crest, embossed in heavy gold inside an invitation. My brother Andrew's wedding, a handwritten note from my mother tucked carefully inside. "Charlie, please come, I miss you. They don't know I'm sending this." I stared at that note for a long time, feeling the old wounds throb beneath the armor I'd carefully built. Why now? Why invite the ghost they had banished? I should have tossed it in the trash without a second thought. Instead, I slipped it into my desk drawer, right beside another envelope, one I'd been too afraid to open for years. The final letter my grandfather, Samuel Bennett, had given me before he died. Maybe it was time to step back into the world that had shut me out. Not as the lost daughter they pitied, but as the woman they could no longer afford to ignore. If you've ever been cast aside by the people who should have stood by you the most, what would you do when given the chance to walk back in stronger than ever? Would you seek revenge or redemption? Tell me your story in the comments. And if you believe that real power is built, not inherited, stay with me. Because this story is just beginning. My name is Charlotte Bennett, Charlie to the few who knew me before everything changed. In the Bennett family, success was not just encouraged, it was demanded. My father, Dr. Henry Bennett, wasn't just a surgeon. He was a legacy third-generation head of cardiothoracic surgery at Memorial Hospital, a man whose white coat seemed stitched from threads of expectation and prestige. My brother Andrew was the natural heir. Gifted hands, charm in spades, ambition burning hot beneath a perfectly curated exterior. And me, I was supposed to follow quietly behind another Bennett name carved into the annals of medical history. For a long time, I tried. I excelled in school, volunteered at clinics, memorized medical textbooks, until my eyes blurred. At my white coat ceremony, my father's hand was heavy on my shoulder, his smile stiff with pride. "One more Bennett for the legacy." He whispered. I believed him. I believed in the path laid out before me until the day that path shattered. It happened during my second year of medical school. I was assisting in a post-op recovery unit when I noticed something off a patient's infection worsening ignored. I raised concerns, gently at first, then louder. The attending physician waved me off. "Focus on your rotation, Miss Bennett. Let the senior doctors worry about complications." Later that night, I overheard a conversation between two surgeons, including my father. They weren't discussing the best way to help the patient. They were discussing how to protect the hospital's reputation. "We'll classify it differently." My father said, "No need for unnecessary audits." It wasn't just a lie. It was a betrayal of everything medicine was supposed to stand for. When I confronted him, his disappointment was palpable. "You think the world is black and white. Charlotte," he said, voice cold, "but someday you'll learn family comes first. Reputation comes first." I didn't want that kind of legacy. Not if it meant silence, not if it meant complicity. So I walked away from medical school, from financial security, from family dinners, where my chair sat conspicuously empty. Andrew called me selfish. My father called me a disgrace. My mother. She said nothing at all. She watched me pack my things into a battered second-hand car and drive off into a future no one in the Bennett family could understand. What followed was 3 years of scraping by. I took night classes at community college while waitressing at a diner whose neon sign buzzed louder than the kitchen I lived in. A studio apartment so cold in the winter, I slept in 3 layers of sweaters. I paid tuition with scholarships, part-time jobs, and more student loans than I dared to count law school. Wasn't the obvious choice. It wasn't a family tradition, it was survival. But somewhere between late-night study sessions and courtroom internships, I realized I wasn't surviving anymore. I was thriving. In law, I found something medicine never gave me: a voice, a power not tied to titles or bloodlines, a way to help real people on my terms. By the time I walked across the stage at my law school graduation, I didn't search the crowd for familiar faces. I knew none would be there, but I also knew this: I wasn't lost. I wasn't broken. I was becoming exactly who I was meant to be. It was an ordinary morning when the past came clawing back. I was reviewing case files in my chambers, half listening to the soft murmur of Diane, my clerk, sorting mail outside my door. The buzz of fluorescent lights, the faint tapping of keyboards, the muted rhythm of courthouse life, comforting in their predictability. Until Diane knocked and entered, balancing a neat stack of mail in her arms. On top of it, thick, heavy, unmistakable, sat an envelope embossed with gold. The Bennett family crest. It hit me like a punch to the chest. My breath hitched, my hand hesitated. Every instinct screamed to shove it away, pretend it didn't exist. Instead, I reached for it. The envelope was substantial, the kind of expensive stationery reserved for weddings, galas, and family triumphs. Not for black sheep, not for disgraces. I turned it over in my hands. The calligraphy was perfect. The name glaring up at me, Judge Charlotte Bennett. Not Charlie, not daughter, not sister. A title they had once said I would never earn. I should have thrown it in the trash. Instead, I slid it into my desk drawer without opening it, tucking it right next to a smaller, much older envelope. The letter Grandfather Samuel had given me 3 years before his death. "Open this," he'd said, "when you're ready to forgive or ready to stand alone. Either way, it will guide you." I hadn't been ready then. Maybe I still wasn't. The rest of the day passed in a fog court. Hearings blurred. Legal arguments sounded distant. All I could see was that envelope, that name, that ghost of a world that had banished me. That night, after a long custody hearing that left my heart heavier than the docket itself, I finally gave in. I poured a glass of whiskey, the same old Taylor my grandfather used to sip, and sat at my kitchen table, the city lights winking outside the windows. The envelope tore open too easily, the paper almost fragile beneath my fingers. Inside, the expected, a formal gilded invitation to the wedding of Andrew Bennett and Sophia Reed, the woman who would become Mrs. Bennett, the next jewel in the family's crown. But tucked behind the stiff invitation card was something unexpected. A small, hurriedly folded note. I unfolded it with trembling hands. "Charlie, please come. I miss you. They don't know I'm sending this. Love, Mom." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a sweeping gesture of reconciliation. But it was something, a crack in the fortress I had spent years believing was impenetrable. I stared at the words for a long time, let them seep into the scar tissue where love and hurt had tangled together. Why now? Why reach for me after so many years of silence? Because they needed me to play a part. Because appearances demanded it. Because some small part of my mother still remembered the daughter she used to cradle in her arms. Or maybe it didn't matter why. Maybe what mattered was what I chose to do next. I reached for the older envelope. Grandfather Samuel's letter still sealed. Still waiting. My fingers hovered, then slowly, reverently, I broke the wax. His handwriting was shaky but familiar, looping across the page with the same firmness I remembered from childhood lessons and whispered encouragements. "My dearest Charlotte," it began. "The road you walk will be harder because it is your own, but there is no shame in choosing integrity over acceptance. No shame in standing alone when standing is the only honest thing left to do. One day the people who turned away from you may try to turn back. They may reach out not because they see you clearly, but because they can no longer ignore the light you became. Forgive them if you can. Not for them, for yourself. But never ever dim yourself just to fit back into a smaller world." I folded the letter with careful hands, the weight of his words settling into my bones. I looked again at the wedding invitation. I could have stayed away, lived my life without ever setting foot near them again. But I knew deep down that walking back wasn't about them anymore. It was about me, the woman I had fought so hard to become. And sometimes the greatest triumph isn't slamming a door shut. It's walking through it, standing tall, and letting your very existence be the answer they never expected. The morning of the rehearsal dinner dawned cloudless and bright. The sky a soft, almost mocking shade of blue. As I drove through the winding roads toward Rosemont Estate, childhood memories clung to the edges of my mind like fog. I remembered Grandfather Samuel's warm laughter during picnics here, the way he'd point to the sprawling white mansion on the hill and whisper, "One day, Charlie, you'll make history. Places like this will just be footnotes in your story." I clung to that memory now, like armor. The gates to the estate stood open, grand and ornamental, as if welcoming royalty. Luxury cars lined the circular driveway, each one sleeker, shinier than the last. My own modest sedan felt laughably out of place among the Ferraris and Bentleys. But I parked without hesitation, smoothing the deep green fabric of my dress, a choice Lily had insisted upon. "It screams effortless success," she'd said, shoving it into my arms at the boutique, like you didn't need their approval to shine. My heels clicked softly against the stone path as I made my way toward the east lawn, where the rehearsal festivities buzzed with artificial laughter and clinking glasses. Servers in crisp white jackets floated between groups offering champagne and delicate hors d'oeuvres. Everything was perfect, everything was polished, everything was built on the quiet understanding that certain people like me didn't belong. And then it happened. "Your Honor." The voice was clear, warm, and ringing with genuine admiration. I turned. Standing a few feet away was Sophia Reed, soon to be Mrs. Andrew Bennett. She wore a simple white sundress, her hair caught in a soft chignon at the nape of her neck. In her eyes there was none of the calculated judgment I'd come to expect from the Bennett orbit, only recognition, only awe. She dropped into a slight curtsy, a small respectful gesture I had seen young attorneys offer in my courtroom. "I didn't know you'd be here," she said, her voice a mix of delight and nerves. A hush rippled outward like a shockwave. Forks clattered against china. Murmurs died mid-sentence across the lawn. Andrew's head jerked up. His face moved through a series of expressions faster than I could track. Confusion, realization, horror. In that instant, everything he had carefully constructed, the sanitized version of our family history. He had likely fed Sophia, the image he had polished for these guests crumbled into dust. I gave a small, polite smile. "I RSVP'd," I said calmly, my voice carrying just enough to be heard without seeming theatrical. Sophia glanced between me and Andrew, clearly sensing the sudden tension, but not yet understanding its source. "Wait," she said, slowly piecing it together. "You two, you know each other." Before Andrew could stammer out some half-truth, another voice answered, "My mother." Margaret Bennett stepped forward from the sidelines, her hands trembling slightly at her sides. "Charlotte is Andrew's sister," she said softly. The word sister landed heavily like a stone dropped into still water. Sophia's eyes widened. "Sister," she repeated, her voice pitching upward. The guests shifted, whispering behind manicured hands and half-empty flutes of champagne. Andrew opened his mouth, closed it again. Finally, he managed to croak out, "It's complicated." Sophia's brows drew together in confusion and hurt. "You told me your sister couldn't handle medical school," she said, voice shaking slightly, that she dropped out, that she didn't amount to anything. Her gaze swept over me again, now seeing the fitted judicial robe beneath the metaphorical armor, seeing the woman he had erased from the family portrait. "You never said she became a judge." The last word sliced through the humid summer air like a blade. Andrew looked like he might crumple on the spot, but Sophia wasn't done. "You didn't just leave out a detail." "Andrew," she said, voice low and furious, "you rewrote the story." Andrew's face turned a deep mottled red. He glanced around wildly, realizing everyone, family, friends, colleagues, were witnessing this reckoning. No whispered apologies, no quiet cover-ups, not this time. He had tried to erase me, now the truth stood before him, undeniable, unmovable. I met his gaze calmly, not with anger, not with triumph, only with the steady, unflinching truth of who I had become, whether he acknowledged it or not. And for the first time in a very, very long time, I wasn't the one shrinking. He was. Sophia stood frozen, staring at Andrew as if seeing him for the first time. The crowd around us shifted awkwardly, unsure whether to pretend they hadn't heard or to lean in closer. Hungry for more scandal, Andrew's mouth opened and closed helplessly, like a man drowning in a current of his own making. "It's not what you think," he finally blurted. "I didn't lie, I just didn't think it was important." Sophia shook her head slowly, disbelief etched into every line of her face. "Your sister," she said carefully, "is a judge, a respected one. I've studied her rulings, I've cited her arguments. And you thought that wasn't important." Andrew faltered, glancing toward our parents, as if begging for rescue. But Margaret stood still, hands clasped tightly in front of her lips, pressed into a thin, unreadable line. And Dr. Henry Bennett. He looked older than I remembered, suddenly stripped of the effortless authority he had always carried like a second skin. There would be no rescue coming. Sophia slipped off her engagement ring, the simple, elegant band Andrew had so proudly chosen, and held it out. Her hand was steady. His was not. "I need time," she said, quietly, pressing the ring into his palm. "Time to figure out who you really are and whether I can trust you again." Andrew stared at the ring as if it had burned him. He looked smaller somehow. Dimmer Sophia turned to me then, and for a moment I braced for anger, for misplaced blame. But all I saw was something raw and honest in her eyes. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "for standing tall." She walked away without looking back, the hem of her white dress brushing the grass like a whisper. The murmurs swelled again around us. Glasses clinked, chairs scraped, a symphony of discomfort. And yet, at the center of it, I stood rooted, steady as stone. Andrew looked at me, then eyes hollowed by the wreckage of his carefully constructed world. "Are you satisfied?" he hissed under his breath. "Is this what you wanted?" I tilted my head slightly, studying him. "I didn't come here to destroy your wedding, Andrew," I said, voice low but unwavering. "I came to stand in my truth. Whatever crumbled, that was built on lies, not on me." He flinched as if I'd slapped him. Our father stepped forward, then clearing his throat awkwardly. "Perhaps we should move inside," Dr. Bennett suggested, trying to salvage what dignity he could. But it was too late. The damage had been done, and no carefully curated image could repair it. I caught my mother's gaze across the crowd. For a moment, we simply looked at each other. And then, very slightly, she nodded. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't redemption, but it was acknowledgement. It was enough. I turned and walked toward the guest house, the low murmur of gossip rising behind me like waves on a distant shore. I didn't hurry. I didn't hide. Each step felt like reclaiming a piece of myself they'd once tried to bury. I wasn't their secret anymore. I wasn't their shame. I was Charlotte Bennett, Judge Bennett, and I was done asking for permission to exist. The rehearsal dinner that evening felt like moving through a shattered house, all cracked foundations and splintered walls. The perfect facade of the Bennett family had fractured in front of everyone, and no amount of champagne or string quartets could mask the jagged edges. I sat at a long linen-draped table beside my mother, the floral arrangements between us wilting in the summer heat. Andrew was conspicuously absent, Sophia too. Their places sat empty, glaring reminders of everything that had unraveled. Conversation at the table was strained and awkward. Cousins asked safe questions about my interesting career choice. An uncle nervously joked about needing legal advice for a parking ticket. I answered politely, sipping my water between words, feeling more like a spectator than a participant. Across the table, my father occasionally glanced at me as if studying a strange new species. He wasn't sure how to approach Margaret. My mother tried valiantly to bridge the gaps, mentioning cases I'd worked on, even citing an article she'd read about my juvenile justice reforms. Her voice trembled slightly when she spoke. But she spoke. It was more than I'd expected. When the main course arrived, Andrew finally appeared, sliding into his chair with mechanical movements. His eyes were shadowed, his jaw clenched tight. The room buzzed softly with tension. A groomsman, David, a colleague of Andrew's from the hospital, raised his glass with an awkward grin. "Well, who would have thought," he said, voice loud enough to carry, "the black sheep becomes the star," to Judge Bennett. Several guests chuckled weakly, raising their glasses half-heartedly. Andrew didn't move. He stared at his plate, his fork motionless in his hand. I forced a smile, lifting my glass briefly, before setting it back down without drinking. It was meant as a joke, an icebreaker. But the crack it opened went deeper than anyone realized. Andrew set his fork down with a sharp clatter. "She's not a star," he said flatly, voice low but cutting. "She quit. She threw everything away when medicine got too hard." The words hung heavy in the air, an accusation delivered with surgical precision. The entire table went still. I counted silently in my head. 1, 2, 3. Then I spoke, my voice calm and even. "I didn't quit because medicine was hard. Andrew," I said, keeping my gaze level. "I left because I refused to compromise my integrity." A A few guests shifted uncomfortably. My father looked down at his plate. I leaned forward slightly, not raising my voice but ensuring every word was clear. There's a difference between failing and choosing a different path. I said, you just never learned how to tell them apart. Andrew opened his mouth, but before he could speak, another voice joined in. My father, enough, Dr. Henry Bennett said quietly but with authority. All heads turned toward him startled. He set down his wineglass with a soft clink and looked across the table at me, truly looked as if seeing me clearly for the first time. Your grandfather once warned me, he said, voice thick with something dangerously close to regret, that the greatest failure would not be losing a title or a career, it would be losing a child's respect. He paused, his hand trembling slightly as he adjusted his cuff. I think, he continued, voice rough, I may have done just that. A stunned silence settled over the table. Andrew looked as if he had been physically struck. I sat very still, my heart hammering against my ribs. My father, a man who had once believed emotions were weaknesses, was acknowledging his role in the rift that had split our family apart. It wasn't an apology, but it was more than I ever thought I would hear. Margaret reached under the table and squeezed my hand gently. Tears pricked at the back of my eyes, but I blinked them away. Not here, not now. Andrew stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the stone floor. Without a word, he stalked away from the table, the doors to the terrace swinging closed behind him. I watched him go without anger. Only a deep, aching sadness. Some wounds heal. Others stay tender no matter how much time passes. The rest of the dinner passed in a strained haze. I made polite conversation. I answered questions about the federal bench rumors swirling around my name. I smiled when necessary, but inside I was somewhere else, standing at the crossroads between the family I was born into and the life I had built with my own two hands. 1 year later, I stood on the steps of the federal courthouse, the morning sun warming the black fabric of my new robe. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with quiet anticipation. All rise, the bailiff called. And as I stepped forward, the weight of that moment pressed gently against my shoulders, not as a burden but as a crown I had forged myself. The Honorable Judge Charlotte Bennett presiding. The words echoed in the marble chamber, richer than any applause, deeper than any ceremony my family had once imagined for me. From the bench I could see them scattered among the audience. My mother Margaret sitting tall, her hands folded tightly in her lap, pride written across her face. My father, Dr. Henry Bennett, a few seats away, quieter, older, but there present in a way he hadn't been for so many years, and Andrew, standing awkwardly at the back near the door, as if ready to flee but choosing this time to stay. His posture was stiff, his face unreadable, but he was here. And sometimes presence says more than words ever could. Sophia was there too, not as Andrew's wife. They had called off the wedding quietly after months of trying to rebuild something already broken. Instead, Sophia had built something new, her own legal aid practice dedicated to community justice. She smiled at me from across the room, a quiet, respectful nod of solidarity. The hearing proceeded smoothly. Routine motions, professional courtesies exchanged. But beneath it all, a quiet current of vindication ran strong. Not the kind born from gloating or revenge. The kind that comes from building your own life so solid, so undeniable, that no one, not even the people who doubted you most, could look away. Later that afternoon, I met my parents for coffee at a small cafe near the courthouse, a new tradition, awkward but sincere. We spoke carefully at first, sticking to safe topics, the weather, court cases, news from the hospital. But as the sunlight shifted through the windows, so did the conversation. Your grandfather would be proud we were, my father said suddenly, stirring his coffee without looking up. I swallowed hard. He always believed you would make history in your own way. It wasn't a sweeping apology. It wasn't an erasure of the years of silence and hurt. But it was something real, and sometimes real is enough. Over the months that followed, the edges between us softened slowly, painfully, but genuinely. Margaret started attending my speaking engagements, sitting quietly in the back rows, her presence a silent offering of support. My father asked for my opinion on hospital ethics cases, grudgingly at first, then with genuine curiosity. Even Andrew reached out, awkward phone calls at first, then tentative conversations over coffee, a rebuilding of something fragile and new. Healing, I realized, wasn't a single moment of catharsis. It was thousands of small choices to stay, to listen, to hope. It was choosing to see the humanity in the people who had once hurt you. Not for their sake, but for your own freedom. Standing on that bench, guiding families through custody battles and property disputes. I understood something my family never could teach me. True legacy isn't titles. It isn't wealth. It isn't even a spotless family name. True legacy is integrity. It's the courage to carve your own path when every voice tells you to stay silent. It's choosing truth over comfort, principle over approval. And it's standing tall, not because you need to prove them wrong, but because you know deep in your bones that you were never wrong to begin with. What would you do if the family that once rejected you finally had to face the person they tried to erase? Would you throw their mistakes back at them? Would you demand an apology loud and public? Or would you choose something harder, something quieter, something infinitely more powerful? Would you simply stand tall on the life you built without them? I used to think vindication would look like dramatic confrontations, grand gestures, or tearful apologies. But the truth is simpler and stronger. Vindication is showing up steadily, unapologetically, every single day. Building your legacy, one honest decision at a time. Holding your head high, not because they changed, but because you did. It's knowing that even if they never say, "I'm sorry," even if they never fully understand, you are still whole, still enough, more than enough. My family didn't change overnight, neither did I, but the distance between who I was forced to be and who I chose to become is a distance I crossed alone, and it made all the difference. So now I ask you, have you ever had to stand alone in order to stand tall? Have you ever chosen yourself even when it cost you everything? Share your story with me in the comments. I want to hear from you. If you believe that real power is quiet, steady, and earned, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with someone who might need a reminder that their worth is never up for debate. Every day we write our own legacies, one brave choice at a time, and your story matters. It always has. It always will.